It was published in January 1963 under a false name. The author said she used a pseudonym because it was a potboiler, and she didn't want it to embarrass her serious work. 1 month later, at 30 years old, she was dead. The name on the cover was Victoria Lucas. Her real name was Sylvia Plath. And The Bell Jar is one of the most personal novels ever written, a book about going mad and the fight to come back, written by a woman who would not make it back a second time.
That's one of the most devastating setups we've done. A woman publishes a novel about surviving a breakdown and then doesn't survive.
Under a different name, in a different country, while living alone with 2 young children in a flat in London during one of the coldest winters on record. I'm Sarah.
I'm Jake. Welcome to Between the Covers. And this is the episode I have been dreading slightly because I know enough about Sylvia Plath to know it's going to be a difficult conversation. But I also know enough to know it needs to happen.
It needs to happen because The Bell Jar is one of those books that has been turned into a kind of cultural shorthand. Sad girl, doomed poet, tragic life. And the shorthand has almost completely eaten the actual book, which is extraordinary, which is funny and sharp and alive and angry, and which has a great deal more to say about ambition and expectation and the specific trap of being a brilliant woman in the 1950s than most people give it credit for.
You're going to make me care about this book.
I'm going to make you care about this book. So, The Bell Jar, published 1963, semi-autobiographical. Nearly everything in it happened to Plath. The narrator is Esther Greenwood. She's 19 years old, enormously talented, on a prestigious summer internship at a fashion magazine in New York City. And she is falling apart.
Why?
That's the question the book is asking. Why does a young woman who has everything she's supposed to want, a prestigious program, male attention, a clear path forward, why does she experience it as unbearable? And the answer the book gives is not what you'd expect. It's not that Esther is weak or broken. It's that the world she's been given doesn't fit her. The magazine world is frivolous and decorative. The men she encounters see her as an object or a prize. Every path available to her, wife, mother, secretary, socialite, requires her to be less than she is. And she can see it. She can see it with horrible clarity. And the clarity is its own kind of torture.
She's too smart for the life she's been offered.
And nobody around her seems to notice that this is a problem. Everyone treats her as though the life she's been offered is a gift, as though the correct response to being young and pretty and talented in New York in 1953 is gratitude. And Esther can't manage it. She can't perform the gratitude, and that failure begins to feel like madness.
The bell jar itself, explain the metaphor.
The bell jar is a glass dome used in laboratories to create a vacuum. Esther imagines her own mind as being trapped inside one, cut off from air, from light, from other people. Whatever she does, wherever she goes, she carries her own stale air with her. She can see the world through the glass, but she can't reach it. She can't feel it. And the bell jar distorts everything she looks at.
That's a terrifyingly accurate description of depression.
One of the most accurate descriptions ever put in fiction. Plath had clinical depression from her teens. We know it was likely bipolar disorder, though that diagnosis wasn't in common use then. And the book captures what it actually feels like from the inside in a way that was revolutionary in 1963 and still resonates completely today. Esther doesn't feel sad exactly. She feels sealed off, muffled, like the volume has been turned down on everything, including herself.
And then she has a breakdown.
She returns from New York, she finds out she hasn't got into a writing program she wanted, and she simply stops. Stops sleeping, stops eating, stops writing. She hides in a crawl space under her family home. She attempts suicide. She is found and hospitalized and subjected to electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, which is administered to her without adequate preparation or pain relief by a doctor who doesn't much care. And it is a horror.
She describes the ECT
in extraordinary detail. The shock of it, the way everything goes white and then dark. She compares it to being electrocuted at the center of the sun, and it sends her further into the jar. But then she's transferred to a different hospital with a different doctor, a woman, Dr. Nolan. And for the first time in the book, she encounters someone who treats her as an intelligent person whose suffering is real and whose inner life matters. And slowly, she begins to come back.
The book has a recovery arc.
It does. Cautiously. The ending is not triumphant. Esther is leaving the hospital and she is terrified. The bell jar has lifted, but she knows it might descend again. She will walk into the world, and it will still be the world, with all of its expectations and limitations. But she is walking, she is going, and that counts for something.
It's not a hopeless book.
People remember it as hopeless because of what happened to Plath. But the book itself is not hopeless. It's about survival. Very difficult, very provisional survival, but survival.
So who was Plath? Because I know the headline, brilliant poet, difficult marriage, tragic death, but I don't know the person.
The person is remarkable. Born in Boston in 1932. Her father was a professor and an expert on bees. There's an extraordinary sequence of poems she writes at the end of her life about bees that connects directly to him. He dies of diabetes when she's 8 years old, and she never properly grieves it. She writes in her journal, "I shall never forgive God for taking him away." She channels everything into achievement. She is extraordinary at school, publishes stories in 17 magazine as a teenager, gets a scholarship to Smith College, one of the most prestigious women's colleges in America.
She was a prodigy.
A genuine prodigy and a perfectionist. And underneath all of it, this catastrophic depression. At 20 years old in 1953, she attempts suicide by swallowing sleeping pills and hiding in a crawl space under her family home. This is the event that becomes the center of the bell jar. She is found 3 days later. She survives. She receives ECT at McLean Hospital in Massachusetts, one of the best psychiatric hospitals in America. But still, in 1953, using methods that we would now consider barbaric, and she recovers. She goes back to Smith. She wins a Fulbright Fellowship to Cambridge in England.
And she meets Ted Hughes.
She meets Ted Hughes at a party in Cambridge in February 1956. And this is one of the most written about meetings in literary history. She had read his poem in a magazine and wanted to meet him specifically. They met at a crowded, noisy celebration. She was drunk and excited, and she quoted his poems back to him, and he kissed her, and she bit his cheek hard enough to draw blood. And they were married 4 months later.
That's a very dramatic first date.
It's the most Sylvia Plath first date imaginable. Hughes was physically enormous, magnetic, a rising poet already winning prizes. And Plath was brilliant and beautiful, and she fell for him completely. She typed his manuscripts. She entered his poems for competitions. When The Hawk in the Rain won a major prize and launched his career, she had submitted it without telling him.
She launched his career.
She is one of the reasons Ted Hughes became Ted Hughes. And then they have children. Frida in 1960, Nicholas in 1962. They moved to Devon. And in the summer of 1962, Plath discovers that Hughes is having an affair with a woman named Assia Wevel, who is the wife of a poet they've both befriended. And she drives her car off a road, not accidentally.
Jesus.
She later describes it to a friend as not a conscious suicide attempt, but a blind, destructive urge. Hughes and Plath separate. She moves to London with the 2 children. Frida is 2, Nicholas is 1. She's in a flat that has been occupied by W.B. Yeats, which she finds meaningful. It's the coldest winter in England in years. She has no hot water. She gets flu. Then the children get flu. She is writing furiously, producing some of the most extraordinary poems in the English language, at a rate of 1 or 2 a day in the early mornings before the children wake.
The Ariel poems.
The poems that make up Ariel, published posthumously in 1965, Daddy, Lady Lazarus, the Bee poems. She is pouring everything she has onto the page, and she is also falling apart. She has a nurse coming to help in the mornings. On February 10th, 1963, she prepares food for her children in the kitchen, puts it where they can reach it, tapes the doors and windows of the kitchen shut, puts her head in the oven, and turns on the gas. The nurse arrives at 9 the next morning and can't get in.
She was 30 years old.
She was 30 years old. Frida was 2. Nicholas was 1. The Bell Jar had been published exactly 1 month earlier.
And then Ted Hughes took control of her estate.
Because they were still married when she died. They had never divorced. So everything, her manuscripts, her journals, her letters, her literary legacy, passed to him. And he became the gatekeeper of Sylvia Plath, which is one of the more darkly ironic situations in literary history.
He controlled the story of the woman his affair may have helped kill.
He edited Ariel, the most famous collection of her poems, and removed about a dozen of the most directly angry poems about their marriage, replacing them with poems from the end of her life. So the Ariel that the world received is not the Ariel Plath assembled. It's the Ariel Hughes chose to publish. We only know this because scholars later found her original manuscript.
He changed the book.
He changed the book, and he destroyed her final journal, the one covering the last months of her life. He said he did it to protect the children. It meant that Plath could never fully speak in her own voice about the end of her life, and letters found after his death, letters she wrote to her psychiatrist, describe him beating her 2 days before she miscarried their second child, claims he denied.
So we will never know the full truth.
The full truth is locked in a destroyed journal, and what we have is the work, which is extraordinary, which is hers, which survived.
So Hughes controls everything, and what does he do with it?
He edits Ariel. He publishes collections of her work over the years. He edits her journals. A version of her journals comes out in 1982, and he reveals in the foreword that he destroyed the final journal covering the last months of her life. He says he did it to protect the children who were 2 and 1 when their mother died, who grew up carrying the weight of that.
What happened to the children?
Frida became a poet herself. Nicholas became a fisheries biologist. And Nicholas took his own life in 2009. He was 47. And the news came out in a brief statement from Ted Hughes's estate. It was a quiet tragedy wrapped inside a larger tragedy. One of the reasons this story is so painful is that the damage radiates outward. It doesn't stop with Plath.
And Asia Wevel, the woman Hughes left Plath for.
In 1969, 6 years after Plath's death, Asia Wevel took her own life. She also turned on the gas. And she killed her young daughter by Hughes at the same time. The daughter was 4 years old. And Ted Hughes went on. He became Poet Laureate of England in 1984. He was honored and celebrated and awarded. He published 1 book about Plath, Birthday Letters, in 1998, the year he died. A collection of poems addressed to her, speaking about their marriage from his perspective, for the first time publicly. It was immediately acclaimed as a masterpiece. It won the Whitbread Prize and the Forward Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prize. In the same year, he died of cancer 3 months after it was published.
He told his side of the story and then died before anyone could properly argue with it.
And people have been arguing with it ever since. Because for decades, until scholars were given access to the full archive, until the unabridged journals were published in 2000, until letters emerged that Plath had written to her psychiatrist describing domestic violence, the public image of Plath was substantially the image that Hughes and his sister Alwyn, who was his literary agent, allowed to exist. Biographers who wanted to write about Plath had to get permission to quote from her work, permission that was controlled by the Hughes estate, and that permission was given or withheld depending on how the biographer treated Hughes.
The estate was controlling the narrative
systematically. And this is why, in the 1970s, when feminist scholars and readers were rediscovering Plath and celebrating her as a voice of female rage and suffering, there was a backlash from the Hughes camp, attempts to paint those readers as hysterical, to reframe Plath's anger as mental illness rather than legitimate grievance. For years, people visited Plath's grave in Yorkshire and scratched the name Hughes off the headstone. Hughes had the headstone replaced multiple times. He never changed the name.
He kept the name on there.
He kept the name, which you can read as obstinate or possessive. Or you can read it as, she was his wife, whatever happened, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. People have argued about this for decades. There is no clean answer.
And birthday letters, because you said it was acclaimed as a masterpiece. What is it?
It's 188 poems addressed to Plath, written over the previous 25 years and published all at once, 6 months before he died. They're in his voice, looking back at their relationship. They're often tender, often haunted, occasionally defensive. They describe the magnetism of her, the difficulty of her, the way he felt watching her come apart. And they're brilliant. Whatever you think of Hughes, the man, he was an extraordinary poet. And Birthday Letters is extraordinary poetry. The problem, bro, and it's a significant problem, is that it is one side of a conversation, and the other person in the conversation is dead and cannot respond.
He gets the last word.
He always got the last word. He destroyed the journal, he edited the poems, and then he wrote the definitive account of the marriage and died. And Sylvia Plath, who was one of the most verbally acute human beings of the 20th century, cannot contradict any of it.
Okay. So, what's the book doing that people miss?
The book is wickedly funny, which almost nobody talks about. The opening chapter, where Esther is in New York trying to enjoy the glamorous life she's been given and simply cannot care about any of it, is very funny. She describes trying to eat a free crab leg at an event and finding it revolting. She goes to a banquet for a famous novelist and watches everyone eat and thinks about nothing but how she will describe all of it to her mother. She is observing herself, observing her life from behind the glass, and the observations are sharp and sardonic and often very funny.
Gallows humor.
Always. The book is also a very precise indictment of the double standard applied to women's sexuality in the 1950s. Esther watches her boyfriend, Buddy Willard, move through the world with a complete freedom she doesn't have. He's had an affair with a waitress. He tells Esther about it, blandly, as though it barely counts. But if Esther were to sleep with someone she's not going to marry, she would be ruined. And she knows this. And she decides to deliberately and defiantly refuse the double standard. She has sex for the first time specifically because she wants to and because she refuses to let the fear of judgment control her. And it goes badly wrong in ways that are both practical and painful. But the defiance is real, and it matters.
She's not passively suffering. She's actively pushing against something.
She's fighting the whole time, even when she's at her lowest. And the fig tree image, this is one of the most quoted passages in the book. She imagines herself sitting in the fork of a fig tree, and on every branch is a different life. One branch is a brilliant literary career. Another is a husband and children. Another is an adventure in Europe. Another is a dozen other lives. And she watches the figs ripen and fall and rot because she cannot choose, because choosing one means losing all the others. And she is starving, sitting there, unable to move.
That's a perfect description of option paralysis, but also of the specific trap of being a woman with ambition in 1953.
Because for men, and Buddy Willard is the example, the figs don't exclude each other. A man can have the career and the family and the adventures. The expectations are additive. For Esther, they're mutually exclusive. She has to choose one life and abandon all the others. And the injustice of that is insupportable to her.
Does anything change? Are we still having this conversation?
We're still having this conversation. The specifics are different. Women in 2026 have options that Esther Greenwood could not have imagined, but the underlying pressure. To be ambitious, but not too ambitious. To want a family, but also a career. To be sexual, but not too sexual. To take up space, but also to be accommodating. That pressure hasn't gone away. It's just changed shape. And the bell jar is still being read by young women who recognize themselves in Esther's specific exhaustion, which tells you something important about how much has actually changed.
And the mental health conversation, because the book is also one of the first mainstream novels to take the inner experience of mental illness seriously, not as madness, not as weakness, but as an experience that has its own logic.
And to take the treatment of mental illness seriously as something that can harm rather than help. Esther's first ECT experience, the one that goes badly, is a horror not because ECT is inherently wrong, but because it's administered without care, without preparation, without the patient's full understanding of what's happening. The second round of ECT with Dr. Nolan, who actually listens to her, is described as manageable. The difference is not the treatment, it's whether the person being treated is seen as a person.
She published the book under a false name because she didn't want it to be seen as her serious work. But it's become more famous than almost any of her serious work.
The Ariel poems are arguably her greater artistic achievement, but the bell jar is the thing that reaches people who don't read poetry. It's the bridge into Plath for most readers, and it's a much more accessible, much wittier, much more structurally accomplished novel than its reputation as a sad girl classic suggests.
What do people need to know before they read it?
Know that it's autobiographical, but it's also crafted. Plath made choices about what to include, what to change, how to frame things. Esther Greenwood is not Sylvia Plath. She's Plath's version of herself, shaped by artistic decisions, and read it knowing it's not just a document of suffering. It's a deeply intelligent novel about a deeply intelligent woman, written with precision and wit and more formal control than it gets credit for.
We'll put a link in the show notes. And if you've found any of our episodes so far useful or enjoyable, we genuinely love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell us what books you'd like us to cover. Tell us what's working and what isn't. We're still finding our feet with this show, and your feedback genuinely shapes where we go. Subscribe helps us more than you'd think.
And if this episode has stirred something difficult for you, please reach out to someone you trust or to a professional. The book deals with some very heavy material, and that's worth acknowledging.
Next episode, Wissig Size, we're shifting the format. Jake leads, different book, different voice. The series thread continues.
Something to look forward to. Thanks for being here. I'm Sarah.
I'm Jake. Thanks for listening to Between the Covers. I hear, I see, I learn.